Uh, Everybody, good afternoon. Can you hear and see me? If you do, please put a plus in the chat box. Excellent. Once again, good afternoon. My name is Julie Kusidi. I'm Executive Director of European Business Association of Kazakhstan. And today it's my honor and a pleasure to welcome everyone to our webinar that we are doing in partnership with Narhos. Eurobac, if you are not familiar with our association, is a non-commercial, non-governmental organization. We are totally independent and we bring together local business, European business, and the diplomatic community. This is our second in the history of 20 years of our association webinar that we are doing. So welcome and thank you for sharing our history. The event is dedicated to a subject. You saw it. You can see it all from the agenda on corporate foresight: how to understand complexity and navigate uncertainty. As you can understand, this is the perfect timing for this topic. And today with us, the main speaker is Dr. John Sweeney, Assistant Professor of Narhos University. We also have with us colleagues from Executive Education at Narhos University. Marina Obraztsova is the Director of the Executive Education of Narhos. So it's my pleasure and honor to pass the word to Marina, and later on she will introduce in more detail John, and we will proceed with the webinar. Welcome and enjoy, and I will see you at the end of our session. And I'm now turning off the camera and the microphone.
Good afternoon, everyone. Warm welcome to our webinar. My name is Marina Obraztsova, and I am a Director of Executive Education at Narhos. Let me introduce Dr. John Sweeney. John is an awarded winner, futurist, designer, and author. At present, he is Assistant Professor of Future Studies at Narhos Education. John, pass the word to you. Enjoy your time, enjoy the webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Marina. Thank you, Julie. Can everyone hear me okay? If I see a few pluses in the chat box, I'll take that as a good thing. Oh, plus. Okay, great. Really thankful for everyone to take time. I know there's obviously a lot going on. Aside from work, we have all the stress of dealing with everything that's happening and family. And again, I hope everyone is safe and staying well. Really excited to see so many people. Very excited to see some friends and colleagues. I'll love to have a chance to pick on them later. So I just wanted to sketch out a little bit some of the things that provide, I think, a little bit of framework to help us understand how to move forward and what might some opportunities and pathways for organizations, specifically corporate organizations, look like. So this is going to draw on some existing research. This is also going to be some ideas that have been coming to shape as the sort of situation has been unfolding. But it's also drawn on decades of futures and foresight. I realize for some of you that might be entirely brand new. So I'll assume no prior knowledge in everything that we're going to talk about. And certainly if you have any questions at any time during, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat box. I'll try to keep an eye on that. As you can see, I've got this different kind of camera thing happening. So my laptop is here, the camera's here, my dog is here. And yeah, would love to have a chance to connect with you. So again, if you have any questions during the presentation, please don't hesitate, put them in the chat box. I'll try to keep an eye on that. And then of course, if I'm going too fast or something, or if you have any issues or anything pops up, please don't hesitate to let me know. So today's talk, as you heard already, is Corporate Foresight: How to Understand Complexity and Navigate Uncertainty. I think now it's quite difficult to talk and think about the future, and so you have to be very careful in how you open with presentations. I wanted to open by saying that in addition to my role as an assistant professor at Narhos, I'm also the director of the Kazakh Research Institute for Future Studies, If you've never heard of that before, it's okay. We're brand new. We're just a little over a year old. So it's a very exciting time to be launching a new Futures Research Institute. We are the first institution of its kind at any university in Kazakhstan. And what's really exciting is we have the chance to do this kind of work with organizations. So we do consulting, we do project research. We also work with students. So we offer these kinds of courses as part of our MBA, DBA programs. We have modules, and we also have undergraduate courses available as well. Because I don't speak Russian, malinki ruski, we also work in 3 languages, English, Russian, and Kazakh. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of our work as it goes on. But certainly, if you have any questions about the Institute, we'll be happy to answer. And some of our team members are also online as well. So where to begin? Well, I absolutely love this quote by Stewart Brand. And I think now more than ever, this rings true for many of us. This present moment used to be an unimaginable future. And I think fundamentally, what this quote really challenges us to think about are precisely the kinds of assumptions that we have about the future and the kinds of ways that we either choose to see or not see certain things based on our understanding of the world. And I think that's really important when we start to think and look around what's happening now, but also when we look back into history. So I pulled this image directly from things that are happening in Almaty. Unfortunately, I'm not in Almaty now. I'm in Belarus, but would love to get back as soon as possible. And I think what's really essential is that actually we have seen these types of things happen previously. So of course, the closest analogy often that people draw is with the great pandemic, the Spanish flu of 1918, which also stretched for not just 1 year. And I think what's really critical here is actually to talk about this question of around imagination. And so that's really essential when we think about foresight as an approach. It is about helping strengthen imagination, but it is also about making better decisions and trying to tie those 2 things together. And I'll talk more about that as we go forward. Again, because my line of work is all about the future, one thing comes up all the time. And what often comes up is the sort of classic joke, where's your crystal ball? Do I read palms? We won't be doing that in this webinar. Maybe we can have another webinar for that if you'd really like. But basically, the idea is, as a futurist, my job is not to predict the future. In fact, no one can predict the future. Now, there's a really interesting point here in that what's happening now, a lot of people saw that this could be an issue. So, of course, there are magazines, there are YouTube videos, there are scientific reports that talked about this exact kind of threat. But it would have been impossible for anyone to know exactly when this would have happened and exactly all of the impacts. So I really want to point that out from the very outset, that as a futurist, my job is not to predict the future. In fact, no one can predict the future. What we try to do is to understand possibilities for the future, how to create better actions today to shape the future. And that's a really important point as we go forward. I will say that my father was an accountant for 40 years, and he thinks it's pretty crazy that I get to talk about the future for a living. So when I explain to him what I do, I often use this quote. And I think it's really nice because it gives us a really strong metaphor or a sort of image in our minds of what this kind of work really is about. So the first line is really important. I'm no prophet, right? There's no prediction. Sometimes there's forecasts, but fundamentally it's not about understanding or saying exactly what the future is going to be. We try to spot little things that could emerge, that could shape the future, and to try to anticipate impacts and effects and to take action to either be ahead of the curve or to try to create the future that we would like. The second part I think is really important. So my job is to make windows where there were once walls. If you put a window into a wall, that allows you to see something that you haven't seen before. It also allows light to come in. So it creates a new inside and outside relationship. And I want to talk more about that as we go forward, but that's really the image I'd like you to have in your minds, that for an organization, foresight is a way of seeing things that maybe were difficult to see before. But also, by letting light in, it allows you to see things internally in a new way, in a different way. And so it is about perceiving, it is about sensing, it is about trying to make sense of things. So it's about what we see and how we see it. I've been very fortunate in my career to work with a range of different organizations. So I worked for a few years with the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent Societies. I helped to really set up Foresight for them. I've worked with large organizations such as Visa, very small organizations like the Castle Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization in Hawaii. Currently, I'm the Foresight advisor for Interpol, so it's really exciting and very difficult, as you can imagine at this time, to be working with global police to understand the threats and the risks of everything that's happening. And I think most importantly, these organizations are very different, from governments to corporate organizations to nonprofits. What they all have in common is they had to try to find a way to take Foresight and to bring it into their organization in a way that worked for them. So that's one of the other key messages today is corporate Foresight. There are lots of best practices, but there's no real cookie cutter way to do it. We're going to talk about some examples and look at what some organizations have done. But really, any organization that does this as an activity has to bring it into a way that works within the organization. And I'll talk more about that as we go forward. So another question that often gets asked is, okay, you know what? We think about the future all the time, and we seem to be missing a lot of things. So why is it really hard to think about the future? Well, it turns out that some research was done on what actually happens in our brains when we think about the future. And the parts of our brains that light up when we think about the future, and this is based on neuroscience, are the parts associated with memory, which means that actually biologically, we are biased to see the future through the lens of the past. So Foresight is actually a way of thinking. It's actually a process. It's different tools that help to challenge that bias that we have. And that's a really important thing we're going to talk a lot about as well. The biases, the assumptions, the things that are part of our biology, but also part of our organizational environment, maybe even a broader environment, that shape how we see things and how we use these kinds of processes to try to see things differently and to open up new possibilities. Again, putting a window into a wall. So futurists have been saying this for a number of years. Really, we walk backwards into the future. So if we see the future only through the lens of the past, Foresight is about turning around. How can we actually begin to face the future, to look at the emerging possibilities, threats, risks, but also opportunities that might be available in times of dramatic change? And certainly we're living through a time of dramatic change right now. Aside from obviously the impacts and the effects of the virus itself, there are a variety of other impacts and effects when we look at sort of economic, political. Certainly we're seeing technology applied in new kinds of ways. So clearly organizations need to understand, need to spot some of these opportunities and imagine how they can move forward in ways that would be productive. So this is a really simple way that I like to start to think about the future. And we're going to look at what this means in relation to corporate foresight for an organization. We're going to start really simple, and then because we're all about sort of dealing with complexity and how things are connected and interrelated, we're going to make it more complex. So I've created a simple matrix. This is an XY axis. We've seen tons of these, right, when we're looking at flattening the curve. So this should be very familiar to most everyone. And I've created a few different types of approaches here. One is thinking about actual and perceptual, and that's in relation to the future. So what the actual future would be, or what the world is going to be, and our perception of the world. That's kind of that x-axis there. The y is more at the organizational level, thinking about internal versus external. So really what we're looking at are a series of 4 dynamics. Starting in the top right, the internal actual, going to the bottom right, the external actual, going to the bottom left, the external perceptual, and then going to the top left, the internal perceptual. And again, we'll talk more about this as we go forward. So a lot of foresight and a lot of how people think about the future is typically this, the external actual. I want to know what the future is going to be. I want to know what the world is going to be like. I want to know maybe the price of oil. I want to know when the virus is going to end. I want to know all of those things. But as Julie and others have said when we started, we now live in a time of radical uncertainty. We're not even 5 or 10 years ahead, we don't know. we might not even think about what is for sure going to happen tomorrow. So now more than ever, the reason we think about the future in the longer term is to challenge our thinking so that we're open to more possibilities and we can take better action. But again, just to highlight, thinking about the external and the actual, what actually could manifest and come into the future, is just one small part of foresight as a holistic activity. And again, that's really important. A series of interconnected approaches and tools and activities that an organization can take to help it make better decisions now. So I think what's really important is to not be drawn in by the power of forecasts and the power of models. Of course, we have to model how the virus is growing. We should pay attention to the sort of economic forecasts that are happening now. But I think there's a really important point here by Pierre Wack, who helped to start scenarios process, and we'll talk more about scenarios in a little bit later. And yes, we'll make the slides available after. Pierre Wack actually worked at Shell and helped Shell, one of the world's largest oil companies, look and think about possibilities for the future. And this is a really great quote because I think it really hits on a really important point for me. And that is that, forecasts are usually right. Forecasts are usually quite good. We've seen a number of models that look at climate change over the years, tracking possibilities. Clearly, we've seen some forecasts for how the virus could spread, how it might, be affecting people. Clearly, now we're seeing new kinds of economic forecasts that we should all be, interested in. But really important, his point is that, forecasts, the danger is that they're often right. Forecasts fail you just when you would need them the most. They often fail to anticipate major changes, major shifts, things that could happen that could make entire strategies obsolete. And so there's a really important question that we ask in Foresight, and that is what if? Now, you can ask what if all day long, but the point in asking what if is to have a what if that is based on some research, based on some analysis, based on tools and methods and theories that have been used for decades that allows the organization to be open to those possibilities, to not only take better decisions, but maybe even to try to take steps to safeguard itself should something radical really happen. And again, we'll talk more about that as we look at some examples. So if we turn that simple 2x2 matrix into something that I think is more of an honest representation, this is what it actually starts to look like. So in between the internal actuals, that would be inside the organization, and the external actual, what the environment will be, that's where organizations want to start shifting behaviors and practices. And I think that's a really important activity that Foresight can support. Another activity, and we're going to come back to that more later, another activity at the internal level, perceptually, so looking inside the organization, but also thinking about how we see the outside environment. This is where organizational learning is quite critical. And so Foresight is often tied to organizational learning. But if you notice underneath, it also says unlearning. So how can we actually think about the processes, the things that are happening, and begin to understand that maybe that means we need to change our sort of normal processes, right? Things might have to fundamentally look a little bit different, or maybe a lot different, depending upon the shifts that we're discussing. And of course, then, again, I'm going to slide this up around in a few different places, shifting behaviors as well. When we think about how we see the organization and how we perceive the organization, this is where the importance of shifting behaviors and practices comes in. And Foresight is really great at spotting some of the gaps, but also some of the opportunities to create new practices and new behaviors within an organization. I then want to move something else that I think is a really great practice and a behavior, but this would be at the organizational level. So this is where organizations, specifically corporate organizations, run experiments, and they do something called venturing. We're going to define that a little more later, but right now I would just say that venturing is about taking an opportunity or seeing an opportunity and taking action to begin to realize it. Of course, any action, certainly in the corporate environment, has some degree of risk to it, but it's about spotting the future, what you think you might be emerging as the emerging future, and to start to try to take action to move in that direction. And I think that's really quite critical. So there's a really great question around what the current crisis will do, what it means sort of in relation to the global economy, and what it means for organizations. I'm going to talk more about that as we go on. I think there's no doubt saying right now that organizations need to think about experimentations and venturing, not just the idea of growing their business, but actually to keep businesses alive. Because fundamentally, there is a seismic shift happening now economically, and will continue to happen clearly. So if you look at some of the impacts just for unemployment, not necessarily just for the current pause in economic activity, but disruptions in a variety of sectors is clearly going to have to create a lot of change for different businesses. And certainly that means some businesses might go away, new businesses might emerge. Very often is the case that actually these kinds of events create new opportunities. So the question is, how are businesses going to be able to adapt? How are governments going to be able to support businesses as they start to come back, in sort of physical operation? Of course, a number of businesses looking online. But I think fundamentally that a variety of these kinds of practices are actually quite useful. And as I think time will show, the organizations that are using these, I think ultimately be more healthy. And I'll talk about that more as a metaphor as we go forward. Finally, then, thinking about the external environment, how we perceive it and how we begin to take action. This is where Foresight links to both strategy and tactics. So strategy is obviously what you want to achieve. Tactics are the things that you do to try to achieve it. And I think that's really important and where Foresight can be quite critical. And of course, all of these are really interconnected. So what this really means and looks like is organizations that have Foresight as part of their DNA, and that's why I put that at the center there, begin to do these kinds of things and actually try to implement it in a way that is rigorous, is responsible, and is really focused on creating some kind of return for the organization. And governments do this all the time. Governments do this focusing on policy decisions. International agencies I've worked with a lot. As I mentioned, now I'm working with Interpol, focus on this in relation to safety and security. So again, lots of different organizations apply this for different reasons, for different ends. And so I wanted to talk about another metaphor. I already talked about putting a window into a wall. This is often a metaphor that I use for what Foresight really is. But I want to change it a little bit. So hopefully everyone brushed their teeth this morning. Raise your hand if you brushed your teeth this morning. I know some of us aren't leaving home, but we still have to brush our teeth. And I think what's really important here is to see Foresight as something that is like a daily practice. We brush our teeth every day because we want to have good breath, but we also want to prevent gingivitis. So really, it's now about staying healthy. So how do organizations stay healthy during this time? Well, I often use that example, but now I'm going to change it to a different example. We're being told to wash our hands, right? You have to wash your hands for 20 seconds. We have to make sure that obviously we're reducing the point of contact for the virus. So washing our hands is now a critical activity. So I think the metaphor here is that Foresight is a form of hygiene. If organizations want to stay healthy in an uncertain and complex business environment, if organizations want to find the opportunities of the future, to spot the emerging opportunities, they have to essentially practice and put into practice things that will keep them healthy. And Foresight is a great way of making sure that you're paying to your health internally, but also to changes that are happening in the environment externally. I really wanted to quickly go over what this looks like in practice and what do organizations that actually do this, what do they get? What's the benefit from actually doing this? A really fantastic study was done by some colleagues in Denmark, and I put a link there at the bottom. Again, I'll share this. They looked at corporations in Europe for 7 years. So oftentimes, there's not a lot of what we say longitudinal data or analyses that's done over a longer period of time to show what is the benefit, what really happens inside organizations who make Foresight part of their DNA. And this study actually found some really interesting results. What they found was that organizations who were vigilant or who really made a serious investment in Foresight, who made it part of their DNA, they actually had two major benefits. One is that they were more profitable than their competitors. They actually made more money. Two is they actually then over time developed greater market capitalization. And of course, that's linked directly to profitability. So they actually had a larger market share. They were able to do better. They were seen as a leader, and that actually then gave them significant returns. So overall, what the study shows is that vigilant firms were more profitable, had greater market capitalization, and fundamentally outperformed their competitors, their peers. And I think that's really critical because this study, in many ways, is a landmark within corporate foresight. It shows the benefit. Now, of course, it was looking at firms in Europe, and that's going to look very differently according to the specific organization and specific to the relation. Many of these organizations were also multinational, so they had operations globally, but they really focused on those firms in Europe. They looked at them and studied for 7 years and were trying to understand what they were doing. And interestingly, what they found was there were 3 things that were common amongst the organizations that were actually applying this in ways that were beneficial to them. The first is that they had what's called a strategic radar. Another way of thinking about this is it's a practice called horizon scanning, where we're looking for trends, we're trying to make sense of the emerging issues. Sometimes we call them the weak signals. We want to spot things that are beginning to create change or that could have an impact on the business. The next is to strategize with scenarios. I mentioned that term briefly. Those are different stories about the future that can help us learn. And then this is another term that I mentioned, the idea of continuous venturing. So looking at strategic investments for growth opportunities, looking to move into new markets, maybe investing in new technologies, and we'll look at some examples of those as we go forward. So to create a strategic radar is actually a means to take how you see the outside environment, to scan for the future, to look at trends, emerging issues, and to align that and enable organizational learning. This is something I mentioned earlier. And I think organizational learning is a great way to connect and bring foresight into the organization. Lots of organizations focus on capacity development. If we think about it, we've got capital resources, we've got human resources, we've got technological resources. We ought to see the future as a resource. So foresight and the idea of a strategic radar is focusing on trying to sense and be aware of what's happening, to spot shifts in the organizational or operational environment, so inside and outside, and to try to bring that into the organization so the organization can adapt and can shift and try to shape the future and hopefully create a better future for itself. One of the ways that scenarios are great to do that is one of the ways that organizations do that that's quite beneficial for them are scenarios. And scenarios are a great way to try to use the future. That's a term that I sometimes use. And scenarios allow organizations to strategize with different possibilities, to look at different options. I'm teaching a scenarios class right now, and our students are working on scenarios for healthcare, for business, for what this is going to mean, the impact of the virus, and of course, in Kazakhstan, and the economic impacts. And most importantly, scenarios, again, are different stories about possibilities for the future. Scenarios are always based on research, so it's not science fiction, not just sitting around making things up. It's always based on data, analysis, and also imagination, and all of those are tied together. The imagination comes through applying tools and methods. Again, we're not just sitting around making things up. It's actually a way of creating a bit of structure so that you can see impacts and see effects and model possibilities for what might lie ahead. Again, scenarios are never meant to be predictions, exactly saying this is what the future will be, that is what the future will be, but they're stories that hopefully help us learn so we could build better strategies and then take better action. And I think then the biggest issue is also finally putting this into practice. So organizations that actually create investments, that actually experiment and venture into new markets based on foresight, again, we're shown to be more profitable and we're shown to have a better market capitalization. And why I think that's really critical here is foresight is a fantastic activity that can help you learn. It's a phenomenal activity to help feed into your strategy. But if you're not using foresight to take better action, then you're missing out, I think, one of the most important pieces and parts. And I think what's really critical is to see the opportunities that could emerge if the right kinds of investments are made now. And so foresight is about the future, of course, but it's very much related to the things that you need to do today. How can you actually shape the future? Okay, Vera's having some trouble hearing, but I think they're trying to work it out. So, yay, it's amazing. Foresight actually works. This 7-year study is phenomenal because it really hits the point home that an organization that makes foresight as part of its DNA can actually show success. And foresight is directly tied to the success of the organization. So corporate foresight works, and it also works in government space and INGO space. There's so many examples of foresight actually creating new policy, creating a new strategy, creating a new plan, being tied to an experiment that actually had a benefit. And I think that's really critical. But, and this is really a big but, foresight works not because it can help you predict the future. That's not what it can do. But it precisely works because it can help us understand complexity. That's what the radar does. That's what the scenarios help us do. And navigate uncertainty. That's exactly what also venturing can do as well. And again, we'll talk more about this and get a little more detail in some of the examples. But I really wanted to hit that point home, that it's not about predicting the future. We do use forecast. We do create scenarios. We look at research and data. We model trends. We model emerging issues. We look at impacts. We look at the effects. But again, we're not trying to say this is exactly what the future will be, because at any time, just like we've seen recently, events can emerge, things can happen that create a whole new operational environment. And that's clearly what we're dealing with now. So let me give you one example of what this looks like in practice. This is about 10 years ago. There was a huge volcanic eruption in Iceland. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name of the volcano, but if you can, good luck. We'll give you some kind of extra credit. And what happened when this volcano erupted was 22 countries suspended air travel. There were about 10 million people stranded all across Europe. This created massive disruptions. Of course, people had sensed that the big eruption was coming, so some people had made sort of changes, but then there was a massive sort of plume of ash that went up, and eventually they said, look, we can't fly planes anymore. And of course, if mostly European travel is disrupted, that can also create disruptions globally. So a lot of people were in a whole lot of trouble. Now, I want you to imagine that you were in the international shipping business. Chances are you were having a pretty bad day. Actually, probably not too dissimilar, probably not too different from what's actually happening right now. If you're a UPS, DHL, or FedEx, you have a lot of issues moving packages right around the world. It turns out that actually one of the organizations before the volcano had invested in foresight, had actually done scenarios as a process. And they created one scenario that actually might sound a lot familiar to us now. There was a disease outbreak that had happened and had caused disruptions to global air travel. Of course, as we're seeing now, global air travel is the perfect distribution system for a pandemic. So clearly, lots of countries, lots of organizations are concerned about passengers, people coming in, even packages potentially as a contaminant. So their story actually forced them to think about alternative means of shipment. So what would a strategy look like? What would the business look like if this happened? This is that what if and what now. And what they actually found was they had a huge vulnerability. They needed to look at creating partnerships. They needed to venture into finding ways and opportunities should this disruption happen. They did not change their entire business model. They did not say we have to go out of business. They did not sell all of their airplanes, but they put pieces into place and they started to venture into find ways to create opportunities for themselves. And it turns out that actually the organization that not just survived, but thrived through the crisis in a majority of markets, not everywhere, was DHL. And DHL actually went back and said, we learned a lot from that scenarios process that was really helpful for actually thinking about how to take action when the crisis actually emerged. So this is a really good example, I think, of where they had done venturing, they had tied it to organizational learning, and they had made it part of their DNA. And this is actually part of a book that they had published where they talk about the work that they had done. And they mention, I think, one thing that's really critical, and that good scenarios incorporate analysis and data, but they're also driven by profound and insightful imagination. And this is, I think, where foresight, as we're going to see, is both an art and a science. And it's not about getting the future right, again, not about prediction, but about making better decisions today. And that's a really important point that I think we have to focus on. I think why this point is really important, to come back to something that Stewart Brand had said. Stewart Brand is a longtime futurist, lives in California, and he has a really great point. You know, scenarios in a workshop have to be plausible, which means they have to have cause and effect relations so you can see the link between the future and the present. And that's what scenarios are. Stories about the future that make connections to the present, that help challenge our thinking, but that have cause and effect or plausible relationships. Reality doesn't have to be plausible. Reality, as we've seen, doesn't have to have a simple cause and effect relation. Sometimes we can't even see the cause and effect relation. Things just seem to happen and come out of nowhere. So what I think that means is that we have to actually really critically challenge the stories that we create about the future, the stories that we see about the future, but also really try to improve our imagination. So a lot of organizations now are investing in programs and projects and trainings that focus on curiosity. How do we help to support people to actually think about information in different kinds of ways, to get information, to challenge our assumptions, to try to make sense of the biases that we have, and to try to look past them? So one of the things that I often use in my work are lots of games and simulations. So this is one of the specialty areas for our institute. We focus a lot on creating custom games and simulations to help organizations think about the future. The picture here is actually a game that was built for the European Commission. It won an award from the Association of Professional Futurists. It's been used now on about a dozen projects. We just published our last article about it, showing how it was being used all over the world. And I think games are really great because they actually force us to confront uncertainty. The whole reason we play games are precisely because we don't know what the outcome will be. It helps us think about a complex environment. It helps us focus on decisions and helps us strategize a little bit better. So I love games and simulations, and I wanted to mention that as one thing as well. Of course, I absolutely love Almaty. It's my new home. I can't wait to get back. I was sad this year. I only went a few times to the mountains. In case you're not familiar with Almaty, this is, I'll make sure I say this right. This is a ice skating rink that is at the highest altitude in the world. This is Medeo. Medeo is beautiful. It's right at the foothills of the mountains. And why Medeo is really great is that it's a phenomenal place and a very sort of great icon for the whole city of Almaty. Of course, for the country, but certainly for Almaty. What our institute wanted to do was to say to people, you know, this has been there for a number of years. Obviously, we're concerned about lots of things, climate change being one of them. What assumptions, what biases do we have about this? And how can a scenario-based approach help challenge our thinking about the future? So my team worked on a project last year to create postcards from different futures for Almaty. Now, some of these futures we might like, some of them we might not like, but all of them are trying to get us to challenge our thinking about what's possible for the future. So in one of our postcards, we said that, well, maybe climate change is really significant, so maybe Medeo should become, or has to become, a swimming pool rather than an ice skating rink. Now, again, this might seem a bit ridiculous, might seem even a bit comical, but that's actually a good thing. So it turns out that we actually, when we laugh, when we feel, you know, sort of happy, our brains release chemicals that actually allow us to learn. So we're actually really open and receptive to learning when we start to, you know, be happy, when we're positive, when we see things in a different kind of way. So again, maybe this is scary, maybe it's terrifying, it's meant to be a little bit ridiculous, and that's the whole point, is to sort of think about what's possible. I mention this because if you're interested in this, please drop us a note. We'd be happy to send you a digital copy. If you're in Kazakhstan, we could also send you a physical copy. Our postcards from the future of Almaty, we made 4 of them. And as you can see in the bottom left, the most important part of this project for me was the blank postcard. So we have different stories about the future and different possibilities about the future. But one of the critical aspects, certainly of corporate foresight, but other aspects of or forms of foresight, is asking people what they want for the future. And how do we shape that future? How do we take steps to create that more preferred future? And I think that's really critical. Now more than ever, we have to envision the future that we want and think about the steps that we can take to get there, knowing all the way that we cannot create the perfect future. We can't shape the future exactly what we want, right? Reality is too complex and too messy. But if we get enough pieces into place, and certainly corporations, governments, international agencies, but citizens and communities also have to be part of this as well. I think that's a really important step that we could take. So, a very long sort of definition. How do we actually define foresight? What is it? Well, as I mentioned briefly, there are 2 parts that I think are really critical, the art and the science. Foresight is an art, meaning it's a practice. So you don't have to actually, be a rocket scientist to do this work. Trust me, if it was rocket science, I wouldn't be doing it. There are tools, there are methods, there are trainings, there are skills you can develop to actually have foresight be part of your practice. And it is all about anticipation, about spotting what might be emerging, about understanding the complex environment, and to anticipate, and then to make a better decision, to take a better action. And again, that's based on the science of exploration. So this is really where the tools and the methods come in. There are academic journals. There are a number of research-based approaches that can be really utilized here very well. And I think it's when those 2 are put together that things are actually quite good. So in our work, we do a lot of applied foresight. We'll work with an organization. We're working now with the government of Kazakhstan. We worked recently with Asia Development Bank to look at different areas and to think how we could bring foresight to help make those areas hopefully a little bit stronger, more resilient, more sustainable, and to focus on how we can shape the future that we would like. I want to go back to something that I mentioned earlier, and that is putting windows into walls. I really like this image because it really forces us to think about how we start to see the outside environment, but also how we can imagine possibilities that might lie ahead. Certainly, why I also like this image is maybe this is how we feel right now, that we have a mountain to climb, that we don't know how we're going to get to the top, we don't know how we're going to get there, and certainly it seems like maybe the future we want is far away. But I think that we can begin to spot that path and begin to move in directions that are better for everybody. And so why I like the idea of putting windows into walls is it forces us to think about 2 things. What are we seeing and how are we seeing it? And that's really what corporate foresight can help organizations do. Where I also think that's important is to come back to language and how we frame things. So windows have a frame, right? We talk about a window frame, but we also frame certain issues. We frame certain topics. And let me give you an example of sometimes why it's important to change the frames that we have. A study was done that asked people to think about crime in their neighborhood. And the first part of the study, the first group was given information and it said, crime is a beast. And then it asked people to imagine options or possibilities for how they should respond. And when people read crime is a beast, their response was, actually, we have to build prisons. That the only way to deal with this situation is to put people into jail, that we need harsher penalties for criminals, that's how we have to deal with this problem. Where this study, I think, is quite interesting is that, okay, let's change the frame that we have. Let's change our language, how we see this issue and how we talk about it. So the second part of the study said, okay, let's not say crime is a beast. Let's say crime is a virus. Again, very timely for right now. And how do you think people responded? Well, it turns out that people responded quite differently. When they saw crime framed as a virus, they said, we have to invest in education. So that change in framing allowed people to see options very differently. And I think that's really critical, and that's another important point of what Foresight can help an organization do. Open up new options, open up new possibilities. And I've also put the link to the study here as well. There's a whole aspect of Foresight called narrative foresight. So thinking about language, thinking about the language of strategy, of vision, of mission, of issue analysis. And I think that's really critical. And so metaphor and language has a really powerful influence over how we attempt to solve complex problems and how we gather more information and make well-informed decisions. And so language is also at the heart of Foresight and the work that we do in trying to find better language to talk about the future, to think about the present, and to, most importantly, connect the two. Of course, I think lots of people are feeling this. This is actually an image from the 2008 financial crisis. Clearly, we feel like we're on the precipice of a very big and significant economic disruption globally. Some are saying that this is not just going to be a recession, but possibly a depression, but certainly a critical time to rethink what was working and what was not was working in relation to the global economy, how we can be more sustainable, and how we can actually move to try to create a better economy that's helpful for more people. Why I like this image is it really, I think, points out something that's quite critical. Of course, we need to identify risks. Of course, we need to try to find a way to mitigate those risks. But actually, a risk management mindset can sometimes not help us. And what I mean by that actually is we can't always identify all of the risks. We can't always, quote, manage the risks, but we have to find ways actually of navigating uncertainties. And those are two very different things, and I'll talk more about that in my final example. So what that often means for organizations is we can't run things like in this picture. So this is the classic sort of old sort of control room from the power plant. What that means is actually sometimes command and control processes, structures that are very hierarchical, top down, where decisions are only made at the top and go down, where you don't have a lot of the insight, the wisdom, the learning from across the organization feed into decisions, can actually sometimes really be a problem, especially in times when we have a lot of uncertainty and lots of things are changing. So we see now some governments are very clear and open and transparent about what they're doing and why they're doing it. Some governments aren't, and there's at the global level maybe a lot of miscommunication or misunderstanding because we simply don't have a lot of the information and a lot of data. So oftentimes we have to think and rethink the kinds of processes that we put into place, the kinds of internal things that are happening, and how that relates to the external environment. And again, narrative framing is really critical. So one thing that I've noticed is that a lot of people are using the metaphor or the saying of war to talk about our current situation. Now, there's no doubt that we might feel like we're in a battle. We might feel like the virus is an enemy. We might feel like we're really struggling to fight for some kind of normal in our lives. And who knows what that normal is going to look like on the back end. But really, I think what's important here is that when we use this metaphor, it creates a certain image in our minds. So what I'm trying to suggest is, what if we change the metaphor? What if instead of thinking about war, what if we used something else? And my teacher for Foresight at the University of Hawaii, and Hawaii, as you know, is an island chain in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, always talked about tsunamis of change. And tsunamis, as we know, are giant waves that can create a lot of damage, but tsunamis happen all the time. Tsunamis are things that, of course, we have to be worried about, but tsunamis are part of sort of the natural world. Tsunamis happen because of earthquakes, and we can't control earthquakes, of course. So how do we get better at surfing those tsunamis? And there's you can see the little surfer down there. And of course, that is something that requires organizations to radically rethink sort of what they're doing and how they're doing it, to focus on what they're seeing and how they're seeing it, and to try to find better ways. The point here is to reimagine something so we can actually imagine different possibilities for the future. So for example, we're doing this as an online webinar, whereas, of course, maybe previously we might invite everyone to come to Almaty, but now that might allow us to have new conversations. New opportunities are being created. Of course, we need to pay attention to the risks, But of course, new opportunities always arise in times of dramatic change. So what options become available to us if we add some windows into our walls? Where can your organization improve its hygiene and begin making foresight part of its DNA? And finally, of course, the most important question, not just for an organization, but for all of us, is how can we find ways to surf the tsunamis of change? Thank you very much. Spasibo большое, Rahmet. We've got a bit of time. If anyone has any questions, would love to engage and interact. Also, I have, I think, some great colleagues that are online as well. Would love to hear their perspective. And thank you again so much for joining.
Thank you, John. I think we can open the floor for questions. Please type your question. It's only thank yous, John.
Thank yous are good. Questions are better.
Well, we have another 6 users typing, so let's see and wait and see.
Great.
So what is your foresight on the end of the fight of coronavirus and when we can travel?
Yeah, so when we can travel, that's a really great question. Certainly, I'm very interested in that as someone who travels a lot, probably a little bit too much. I think that one of the biggest challenges that we have is precisely what we're starting to see happen now. So Japan is about to announce a further lockdown, it looks like. Singapore has announced a lockdown. And these types of events, these pandemics, move in waves. So the tsunami metaphor is actually quite useful. We have to actually get better and realize that maybe it's not just the next few months, possibly 12, 18, 24, because viruses also can mutate as well. So we could see a variety of disruptions that could impact not just sort of casual travel, obviously business travel, the entire tourism sector for a significant amount of time. My particular forecast is that we are going to see significant disruptions continue to happen, but it's also possible that we get lucky, and I think that's really critical here as well. If we're able to engineer a vaccine that's usable and there are no major mutations, there aren't significant waves that force further lockdowns, then possibly by the end of this year, maybe we're in good shape. But it's also possible, and again, this is where the alternative approach always comes forward, that we have to be open to the possibility that this is going to be part of our lives for the next few years. And maybe actually that this actually creates a new sense of awareness. So we're taking action that becomes and creates new norms, new things and new approaches and processes and practices that maybe don't go away. So maybe some businesses actually decide, wait, we don't need certain forms of travel, and that actually creates travel disruptions, and then that leads to changes and shifts in the industry. So I think, again, we're dealing with a complex situation, but my forecast, my sort of best bet, if you ask me my personally and professionally what I think we're going to see disruptions go certainly more than just the end of this year, that there will be significant disruptions, and certainly there's the economic impact as well. At the same time, obviously, we saw a sharp decline in the price of oil. So we're really starting to see, I think, a number of things kind of come to a head, and that those are going to have significant disruptive impacts and really create, I think, a lot of disruption and change in a whole lot of places.
Okay.
So there's a few questions. There's a question about the Monte Carlo method in my research. So I have participated in projects that have used the Monte Carlo method. Monte Carlo is a method that sometimes can generate hundreds, even thousands of scenarios based on quantitative modeling. And I think Monte Carlo is quite important when you have good data. One of the challenges in, let's say, this particular situation now is the data is evolving. So there were questions actually about, do we have all the data? Is the data good that came out of China? Are we tracking everything? Are governments providing the right kind of data? Monte Carlo works really well when you've got significant data. But again, I think now the question is, if we take that data and analyze it, we still have to put it in a way that's helpful for people to understand and digest. So again, I sometimes have used and been parts of projects for Monte Carlo, but it's not one of the core methods that I do. I do quantitative analysis, but I focus more on the qualitative point of connection as well. So a lot of my Foresight work focuses on participatory methods and approaches that organizations or governments or international agencies can use as part of that. Another question, yes, I believe the video recording will be made available. So I think it's on our Facebook page, and then also we can be in touch if you have that, if you need that. It says, do I believe that these challenges will affect us to behave differently? This is a fantastic question. I think that the most interesting and the most important impacts of what's happening right now are going to be in society, are going to be in culture. So maybe masks become a whole new normal thing. Clearly, that means that people are going to think differently about how they interact with other people in public. But also relationships maybe will be different, right? If you don't have a boyfriend or a girlfriend in this time, or don't have a partner, and you want to meet people and everyone's going around wearing masks, right? It creates a whole new relationship. There have been stories online about people, how do you date people during this time? Families being together, it creates all kinds of, issues. So, but maybe new opportunities for people to be closer together. So I actually think that behaviors will change in some places out of this. And it will create new opportunities for organizations that want to look at what those behaviors can be and think about how to, create them. Already, I think we're seeing lots of organizations realize that either we were underutilizing digital tools that were available, or they didn't have the things in place to capitalize on a lot of digital tools. So some organizations, it was really hard to kind of shift. I think other organizations, saw the need and behaviors were kind of shifted. So I really think that actually the challenges that will affect us will change behavior. Certainly, I think for a long time, people are going to really think about washing their hands when they come home, or before they sit down to eat. But I think fundamentally, we will see people really start to challenge their own thinking, and this will create kind of a shift in sort of what people do at the end of the day. There's a question from Katie. Hi, Katie. So Katie says, in the middle of the tsunami, how do we take advantage of the many silver linings happening in order to better shape our future? For example, families coming together more often, lessening of environmental damage, more sleep. I'm glad you're getting more sleep. I'm not sure I'm getting any more sleep, but I think actually that, what's really helpful in this time is not to just focus on the negative. Of course, the negative stuff is out there, and we have to be concerned about it. The virus impact is clearly, destroying families, right? There's going to be, it's going to impact lots of people's lives. The economic impact is also going to significantly impact people's lives, and obviously we've seen that start to happen already, and the variety of crises sort of around that. But how do we get better at spotting, and some organizations and some futurists are doing this, of looking at the bright spots, right? Of thinking about ways that we can actually heighten the aspects that we like. And so, yeah, I think that there are lots of silver linings that we have to pay attention to. Maybe more organizations now are interested in flex time, or people working at home. Maybe schools start to leverage more online learning opportunities. Maybe it creates a new awareness for how people think about public space, and we feel better about, taking care of it. You mentioned the environmental impact. I mean, one of the biggest things to think about now is, the climate crisis hasn't stopped just because the virus is happening now. Clearly, climate change is something we need to pay attention to. And of course, carbon emissions, and there has been a reduction overall given the drop in economic activity. But if things go back to normal, that could actually create more problems, right? So people have been saying in Almaty, the air is quite clean, the air is quite fresh, and in many cities that have had air pollution problems. So how do we get actually better at looking back and saying, this is what we liked, let's keep this. But also, this is what we didn't like, let's change it, right? And I think Foresight can help us do that by spotting how we actually find emerging parts of the future, how we have a conversation about what we want for the future, and begin to take steps to build it. So again, really important point. Thank you, Katie, about sort of focusing on those positive aspects. And again, positive and negative, and sort of the bridge between the two is a critical part of what we do. Romano in Taiwan. Hey, Romano, a good friend and colleague who is living in Taiwan, which did a great job apparently, and is doing. So he talks about balancing the need of embracing complexity with the need of simplifying complexity into plans, steps, and procedures. And are there ways of communicating complexity? This is a fantastic question. I think that you're hitting on a really important point in that how do we actually talk to people about complexity and these kinds of issues. Lots of organizations do try to simplify complexity, but if you simplify it to the point that you water it down, then you fundamentally have washed over, which is typically a lot of the interesting bits, the interesting points. I think the organizations that embrace complexity are precisely the ones that do focus on transparency and communication. So for me, I think that balance is all about finding ways of bringing more people into parts of the process. As I mentioned, kind of breaking down that command and control structure, and actually allowing people to participate in decision making. And across an organization, oftentimes that means that you have to find more fluid ways of making decisions. You have to, and this is a word that's often used, right? Find more agile processes for allowing those shifts to happen. I think fundamentally that this question around embracing complexity is something that whether or not we like it, we have to do it. I think the simplifying complexity is all back to that sort of what we see and how we see it. So I think the organizations that we're going to see do well and come out of this particular crisis and be able to navigate the uncertainty of it are precisely those that are able to find ways to surf the tsunamis. And I do think that when we think about plans, steps, and procedures, those don't have to be complex. And so I think you've actually hit on a really important point. When the crisis began to emerge, one of the things that we were told pretty early on was wash our hands. Now, as we know already, that's something that hopefully we're doing on a daily basis. We come back home, we're out, we're going to eat, right? But by improving that hygiene, and again, back to the metaphor of hygiene, the simple act has an effect on the complex environment. So by us washing our hands, not only do we safeguard ourselves, we safeguard the spread. And so again, part of the important piece there, I think, and your question about complexity is all thinking about helping us think about the connections between things and how we're parts of interconnected systems. So oftentimes with an organization, I say in a complex environment, in a complex situation, focus on the low-hanging fruit. And low-hanging fruit are things that we can grab easily. So, of course, one of the easiest things you can do is to tell people to wash their hands. Now, of course, in lots of places, maybe there's a water shortage, water crisis. That's a significant issue. But hygiene fundamentally is one of the easiest and best ways that everybody can start to have an impact. And I also think we're starting to see that messaging come forward with wearing masks. So when people go out in public, wearing a mask can not only safeguard you, but also safeguard others as far as spreading the virus and spreading other diseases. So I think that's really critical, is to be able to actually find ways of finding the simple actions that if sort of scaled across a particular system or in a particular context, can start to have a significant impact and effect. And so again, that's going to look different in different organizations, of course. Certainly our university, even as long as like 6 or 8 weeks ago, we're having conversations about online, what this could mean for us, what was sort of the actions that we needed to take immediately and steps that we were to put into place. And I think the university benefited from that because a lot of people early on were trying to spot the future, seeing the complexities and imagine the kind of low-hanging fruit to communicate that as well. And again, communication was really a critical part of that, and then to take steps to implement that. So again, going to look very different in lots of organizations. Of course, there's no formula here. There are recipes for what it can look like, right? It's not always black and white. A lot of testing, a lot of sensing, and a lot of reframing. But I think fundamentally that the best way to communicate this is to make it consistent, to make it current as best available as much as possible, and also to really reinforce the messaging around complexity, that things will change. Now, people might take that sometimes, not too well, right? That, of course, things are always changing. So how do we know? How do we know? How do we know? If people understand that things are changing, then I think that's an important part of the messaging too. So some governments are doing that well. Some governments are not doing that well. And other organizations, I think, can learn a lot from the kinds of responses we're going to see during this time. Okay, a question from Asselbeck. Now there's a cancellation of protectionist measures in the economy. In your opinion, how can this help us to put a window into our walls? I think what's really interesting is that we're going to see lots of governments and lots of organizations take protectionist measures. Fascinating research. I didn't include it in this presentation. I just saw it yesterday. looked at the impacts of pandemics economically, not just for 1 or 2 years, but for decades, versus war. And we talked about wars. What we find is after a war, there's often an ease of interest rates. There's often significant government investment, and oftentimes there's significant growth as that investment is focused, of course, on rebuilding infrastructure, on making sure the economy shifts from sort of wartime to post-war time. What this group actually looked at and found was for European-based pandemics, and in some ways we're seeing that happen now with the crisis there, that actually the economic activity and economic growth and, let's say, normalcy, even though that may be different things in different places, that has taken longer. And people actually, because the virus has created a change in their thinking, tend to save more, spend less. And so what they saw was a significant sort of stagnation, more protectionist measures actually in relation to post-pandemic economic activity. So that's why I think actually that, again, aside from the virus itself as a crisis, the economic impacts will be quite significant and will be quite significant for some time. I think as we'll see this sort of on-off. So again, Singapore just initiated another lockdown. Looks like Japan's going to be doing one as well. And of course, some economic activities come back online in China. But we, again, if further outbreaks happen, then potentially we'll see this kind of pausing sort of happen. So the question is, to speak to your point, I think the kinds of protectionist measures, are they going to be around organizations trying to build resiliency as we have economic activity like this, or is it going to be organizations who are looking to invest in long term and sort of come back to their core purpose and think about how they could then find ways of maybe pivoting if there's a potential venture opportunity, or if there's the opportunity for an organization to actually think about sort of reframing itself. So one thing that's interesting is I saw a furniture company is now focusing on making stand-up desks. A number of people, of course, those that are fortunate enough to have a job that allows them to work from home, are now actually having, maybe health issues because you sit down all day, right? Like we're sitting down now doing this webinar. So people want to buy a stand-up desk for home. So they've started to manufacture them. They've started to market them and said, look, you can make this, we send you the materials, you put it together yourself. It's healthier for you. It allows you not to sit down all day. You don't have the adverse reactions. And this is a good opportunity. So again, that's something that, of course, businesses have offered. Maybe people have at their home if they work from home already. But more people might be thinking about that as an opportunity. So that, to me, actually is in some ways is a protectionist measure that a business took to actually safeguard themselves during this time. And maybe it was a venture. So maybe it's an opportunity for new growth for them. But I think fundamentally that we will see that these protectionist measures will be put into place. Of course, we saw recently in relation to food as well. So food shortages maybe are a significant issue, not because the food's not growing, but because maybe people aren't there to harvest it. People aren't there to actually carry on the sort of supply chain. So, of course, we saw Kazakhstan worried. Kazakhstan limited its wheat exports. Vietnam, which is a top 5 producer of rice globally, has signaled that it's going to limit potentially rice exports. So these are the things we have to be concerned about, are the kinds of shifts that might happen to a variety of systems and the connections between those systems. But I think we're in for certainly a number of waves and a number of tsunamis as we go forward. And I think ultimately that the window that we want to put into the wall is to see the reality of what is happening now, to understand the possibilities for what might lie ahead, and to begin to take actions that again, if you're a business, that can safeguard your business as much as possible, build some resiliency, but also to spot potential ventures, right? So clearly the opportunity to move into digital is something that lots of businesses, if they haven't done already, obviously are already behind on and need to think about, but also maybe looking at opportunities for markets, new partnerships, new business models that if they're available to them. Open data resources that help me. Yeah, so I have some resources I'd be happy to share and can certainly provide that. So there's a question here about media is influencing how we see the virus. Yeah, I think actually we're dealing with dual crises, maybe triple crises at the moment. There's the economic crisis, there's the virus itself, and then there's this information crisis, right? We live in a time of fake news, misinformation, disinformation, but also unclear data. Are we getting the right information? And so now more than ever, it's really critical that we again challenge our assumptions, challenge our biases. I think, of course, there are very much concerns about in relation to the origin of the virus and what that means. And I think that you're raising a really good point. Sometimes, and some people have said this, the cure is worse than the disease. Of course, there's nothing more important than human life, and we need to safeguard human life. But I also agree very much that a significant economic downturn, and clearly we're facing that, right? Again, a recession, if not a depression, will have an impact on people's lives that certainly could be just as detrimental and fatal as the virus itself. So this is the challenge, right? This is the significant challenge of our time. How do we find ways to have a global economic system, to have businesses that could help to support and sustain life, and to do that in a way that is obviously not detrimental to themselves or the environment? I mean, fundamentally, I don't think that's significantly different from what happened before. What's different now is the environment that we're operating in looks very, very different. High uncertainty. We don't know sort of from day to day. Is the airport going to be open? Is this country going to be open? People going to be able to travel? Do people want to travel? School's going to be closed? School's not going to be closed? And again, that creates lots of significant disruption. So I think that fundamentally that this hygiene that we're seeing put into place, right, the kind of lockdown, is meant to stem the tide and to clearly deal with the crisis that has affected places like Italy, like Spain, like we're seeing happen now in the US. Because when the healthcare system gets overwhelmed, that has an impact not just on people with the virus, but of course on lots of other people as well. So let's say you're in your kitchen and you're using your knife and you slice your finger open. It's not a really good time to go to the hospital to go get stitches, and it might be difficult to receive normal care if the healthcare system is really overwhelmed during this time. So that's, I think, why we're seeing lots of extreme measures being taken. But I think potentially what we're seeing is a rethinking of what economies can and should do. There was a recent article by the Financial Times, typically a very conservative organization, that said now maybe we need to look at universal basic income and to think about new economic models in ways that from the Financial Times would have been unthinkable just a really short time ago. So again, what this crisis really does is it shifts the window of possibility. And now we're really starting to see different organizations, governments, think about those window of possibility and try to imagine what those could be. So how do I fill the narrow corridor by Darren Osimoglu as an opportunity for future economic growth? Unfortunately, I would say that I'm not necessarily familiar with that. If you can type in more information, that would be great. I think I know what that's hitting on, but I'll have to come back to that question. Brendan, is that Brendan from Norhouse? Hey, Brendan. A question about the concept of growth model for governments and the private sector. Thinking about sort of, solely economic well-being. Yeah, 100%. Future Studies, and I think you mentioned this, has a long history of calling into question the kinds of economic models that have clearly created a variety of forms of crisis. So one of the most interesting analyses that was done, I think, is looking at what was happening before and what was normal and what might normal be after. And to be honest, normal was part of the problem, right? We clearly had a huge inequality, and we still have inequality issues. We clearly are in the middle of a climate emergency with a variety of forms of impacts that are creating challenges all over the world. So sustainability has to be at the forefront of how we think about navigating the crisis. And this is where things like the triple bottom line, where it's not just profits, it's not just people, but the planet has to be a significant part of that too. And so Future Studies looks at everything. It looks not just at economic impacts, not just at political. It would look at not just technology, but environmental would be part of that as well. And to think about how to put that at the forefront of the analysis and to make that a critical part of it. So I think you're hitting on a really important point. There is no, as we say, planet B. we have to fundamentally find a way to make everything that we have sustainable. We have a certain carrying capacity on the planet, and we have to make that critical and part of it as well.
John?
Oh, yep.
If you could read your private message, I think we kind of running out of time. So maybe
sorry.
if you can take a last question.
Yeah, there's so many really good questions. Okay. Let's see. Okay, last question. So can we treat this time to make our investment portfolio as a right time in contrast to last year's market growth? This is a great question because I can tell you, do not take financial advice from me. I think that fundamentally that it is a very volatile time, and that likely we haven't seen any kind of stability come to any significant markets, whether we're talking about the Dow, the FTSE, the Nikkei. So I think fundamentally that if you are willing to venture and you see the risk and you're willing to make that investment, of course, right? By all means. If you ask me where areas I think are for growth, of course, anything related to health and wellness, anything that's focusing on digitalization, clearly has a lot of upside right now. And again, from a Foresight perspective, we might choose to do further analysis and research. And this is one of the things that we're focusing on for our institute, but also at ExecEd at Narhos, to look at where we can help organizations do research to spot those opportunities. And again, I certainly don't think it's all doom and gloom, even though we are very much dealing with a crisis. There are lots of opportunities here, not just for businesses and organizations, but for communities, for countries, to find a better pathway and to try to create a better future. And so we have to balance that. We have to clearly pay attention to what's happening that we don't like, clearly try to shape and move towards what we like, and to try to find better ways to do that collectively. Yeah. Thank you. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, John. This was very interesting. And thank you for all the participants who were very active here. I believe that we might have a little bit more questions. You can always contact us through our emails, and I'm sure that those are from Narhos. You have the contact of your direct organizers. Yes, and John puts here email. Thank you very much. Everyone, thank you for participating. Marina, thank you very much for organizing. And John, thank you for your time, for sharing your experience and expertise. We're looking forward to seeing you at our next event. It will be next week, I believe, 14th of April, and you will be getting notifications separately. So Marina, if you would like to say a few words.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John. It was really interesting presentation. Thank you for participants. Hope to see you on our next webinar. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Enjoy Belarus, John.
Thank you. Bye. До свидания.
Bye, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Yuli.
Bye-bye. Thank you.